let's talk about Thomas Macaulay Millar's commodity model of sex. This is one of my favorite texts to talk about. The commodity model of sex is everywhere around us. It is incredibly influential. And once you learn about it, then you can start to notice the ways that it shows up in all different areas of thinking and all of these different aspects of our social world. It is pervasive and it's not great. So under the commodity model of sex, sex is treated as a commodity, as a good or an object. Now, I want to be very clear about two things right from the start. One is that Millar is discussing and analyzing the commodity model. He believes that this view is very widespread in our world. But Millar is not endorsing this view. He doesn't think it's a good way to think about or understand sex. But we need to identify and understand how our social world tends to view sex if we want to be able to, effectively intervene and perhaps change things. The second point I want to be clear about right from the beginning is that despite its name, the commodity model of sex is not focused on sex work, nor is it a good model to use to think about sex work. Sex work could be analyzed using the commodity model, but this model of sex is about just a much broader set of interactions than just sex work, and it's primarily focused on sex and sexual roles within the context of relationships or marriage, hookups, dating, and everything leading up to and surrounding those contexts. So let's go into the features of the commodity model of sex. The commodity model of sex treats sex as an object, as a thing. Under this view, women have the sex, and men are trying to get the sex. It's incredibly gendered, and it's incredibly binary, cisnormative, and heteronormative. We'll talk about these issues when we get into the stereotypes and exclusions taking place within the commodity model. So, in the commodity model of sex, women are slotted into the role of being the gatekeeper to the sex. Their job here is to say either yes or no to the men who are working to acquire the sex. It's not just that this is a duty assigned to women, it's that women are not viewed as being interested in sexual activity. They're not viewed as having sexual desires of their own. Their whole interest in sex is just that of either saying yes or no to men seeking the sex. And connectedly, that role is the extent of women's sexual agency within sexual interactions under this model. There is nothing more for a woman to do than to passively say yes or no to men who are trying to have sex with her. In contrast, men are viewed as being highly interested in sex and as the primary agents within sexual interactions. So under the commodity model of sex, men are viewed as being very focused on pursuing women to get the sex. So within the commodity model, sex is not an interaction or an activity. It's a good, it's a thing. And women specifically are the ones who have this good. So women are reduced down to these specific sexualized body parts, such that their worth as people ends up being based on the worth of the sex that men are trying to acquire from them. And when sex is viewed as a commodity, it gets treated as having value just like any other commodity based on the market economy. So when there's demand for something, its value increases. So sex with women who other men are also want to have sex with is seen as more valuable, as more worthwhile than other sex. It becomes a competition and a scorekeeping game. So notice the language of, I'm going to score tonight, how that draws on this framework. So we can see this model or this way of thinking showing up in like the slang that we use and the phrases that we use in all kinds of tiny little ways in everyday life. The commodity model of sex also is very, very focused on a woman's worth in terms of how much sexual interaction she has had with men. It's especially focused on notions of virginity and purity. So if we think back to the standard conception of virginity and how it's been constructed and the social role that it plays, we can see those things especially strongly within the commodity model of sex. The social role of the notion of virginity is sort of exemplified by the commodity model of sex, and how the commodity model of sex classifies a woman's value in terms of both how much she's been pursued and how little sex she's actually had. We also see this showing up very strongly, this whole way of thinking about sexual interactions and women's value, and these ways of thinking about what sex is. We see this showing up especially strongly within K-12 sex ed courses, and especially sex ed courses that are created within the abstinence-only movement. Although I do want to be very clear about this. This mindset doesn't only show up within abstinence-only sex ed. So a pretty common practice within K-12 sex ed is to do something like take a piece of tape and pass it around the room. And each person puts the piece of tape on their arm and then passes it to the next person, who also puts that same piece of tape on their arm. And after it's gone around the room, the teacher holds it up to show how dirty and gross it is. And the message here is, this is what it's like when you have sex. Each time you have sex, it makes you dirtier and worth less desirable. Now notice who the you is in that sentence. This message is primarily directed at girls, right? Because we're talking about K-12, so we're not talking about adults. We're talking about girls and people who are children who are perceived to be girls. There are a lot of very similar analogies that get used pretty commonly in K-12 sex ed. So let's see here. Students have told me about being taught that having sex is like wearing a new pair of sneakers, and after the first time you wear them, the sneakers get dirtier and dirtier and dirtier, and each time you have sex, you are like that pair of sneakers, and no one wants to put on a dirty pair of sneakers. Another analogy is to equate sex to chewing a piece of gum, and teachers will talk about how no one wants to chew a used piece of gum. And within this analogy, notice how women, like their whole personhood is being reduced to that of being a chewed piece of gum. And so on all of these analogies, a woman's worth is based on how pristine or pure she is. And once she has sex under this model, she's viewed as dirty, unwanted, and her value disappears. Now, these things have really real and serious consequences. One awful illustration is the case of Elizabeth Smart. Some of you may have heard of her. She was 14 years old when she was kidnapped out of her bedroom. This was in Utah in 2002. She was held captive for about 9 months, and she was repeatedly raped during that time. She was eventually rescued. Her captors had started taking her around town, and someone recognized her. So the people who had kidnapped her as a child, I just want to make sure I keep emphasizing she was a child. So the people who had kidnapped her and repeatedly assaulted her, they had left her sitting in a car because they knew that she wouldn't try to escape. And she didn't. She was rescued because other people recognized her. Elizabeth Smart has, in the years after this happened, she's spoken quite a lot about why she didn't try to escape in those moments when she was left sitting in the car. So again, she was 14 when she was kidnapped. She'd been through a few years of her school's sex ed program, and she was taught all of those analogies that we just went through. When speaking about this, Elizabeth Smart has said, and I'm going to quote her directly because I think her words are important. She said, "I thought, oh my gosh, I'm that chewed up piece of gum. Nobody re-chews a piece of gum. You throw it away. And that's how easy it is to feel like you no longer have worth. You no longer have value. why would it even be worth screaming out? Why would it even make a difference if you are rescued? Your life still has no value. Elizabeth Smart is currently just this incredibly badass and awesome advocate for survivors of sexual violence and for comprehensive sex ed. And I think that she and her experience really speak to how much of an effect these kinds of messages do in fact have, and how important it is that we get these things right. So Elizabeth Smart argues against abstinence-only sex ed, which is so fundamentally entwined with a commodity model of sex. And she argues for the importance of comprehensive sex education programs. It's worth thinking about what a good sex ed program would look like and what model of sex it would instead be based on.